Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddham dhammang sanghang namasami. Dear friends, this evening I will be speaking about the fourth nutriment out of the four nutriments, which are explained by the Buddha as creating the conditions for sustaining of this life and for leading onwards to rebirth, continuation on the round of samsara. This is the nutriment of consciousness, or in the Pāli language, vijnana. Vijnana, āhāra. Āhāra means food, so the food of consciousness. There are several different things said in the suttas about the nutriment of consciousness, and they don't all quite go together. It seemed like there were two layers of teaching in the suttas. Perhaps one level was the earliest teaching, and perhaps another, one of the teachings as something that became crystallized later on. So my goal here is not to confuse you, but to try to show this teaching in as practical a way as possible. Consciousness is the knowing faculty that cognizes objects. It says in the sutta that the consciousness nutriment supports name and form. This is explained in dependent origination as related to the birth of a new life, that there is consciousness and a name and form coming together that's creating an individual, and those factors are mutually interdependent. You can't have a living person without both consciousness and name and form. And with that arising of a new individual, a new infant growing in the womb, or a newborn baby who's just coming to life, there arises the six senses, the sense faculties, and from the sense faculties comes feeling, from feeling comes craving, and then we're off to the races in terms of this descending cycle of dependent origination, which is leading us to go around to another birth, to a repetition of craving, clinging, becoming, birth, and then from birth, aging and death, sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair. Elsewhere, it's shown in a more abstract way. There's an important one of the suttas about this. It's called Pāguna of the Top Knot. It's in the Samyutta Nikāya, 12.12. And this is showing that in the case of the nutriments, there is not a person consuming the nutriments, but there is an impersonal process. I'm going to read a bit of a longer passage here so you get the context. The Buddha said, mendicants, there are these four fuels. They maintain sentient beings that have been born and help those who are about to be born. What for? Solid food, whether coarse or fine. Contact is the second. Mental intention the third. And consciousness the fourth. These are the four fuels that maintain sentient beings that have been born and help those who are about to be born. And when this was said, the Venerable Pāli of the Top Knot said to the Buddha, "But sir, who consumes the fuel for consciousness?" "That's not a fitting question," said the Buddha. "I don't speak of one who consumes. If I were to speak of one who consumes, then it would be fitting to ask who consumes, but I don't speak like that. Hence, it's not fitting to ask. Hence, it would be fitting to ask, consciousness is the fuel for what? And the fitting answer would be, consciousness is a fuel that conditions rebirth into a new state of existence in the future. When that which has been reborn is present, there are the 6 sense fields. The 6 sense fields are the condition for contact. And then Pāli, I guess I don't know if he's dense or if he's just given as a humorous example. He says, "But sir, who contacts?" And then it goes along with the other elements of dependent origination, where Pāli keeps asking, who is doing this? And the Buddha says, no, it's not personal like that. It's about the conditions which are supporting a process. So we know that consciousness has to do with rebirth. And we know that consciousness is supporting name and form. Here's an idea, this is my own personal idea, about how consciousness supports rebirth. We have learned and studied for a long time about the 5 aggregates affected by clinging. The Pancha 5, Upadana, clinging, Khanda are aggregates. In this case, aggregate is meaning not something pure, but something which is a compound. And Upadana is, it means clinging. So when we cling to them, that's one way of thinking. When we cling to them, then that is leading us on to suffering. But then there's another way of thinking about it, because we just read in the sutta, you shouldn't say, but who's clinging? So you shouldn't say, I am clinging to the khanda, and that's what causes it to be suffering. Instead, the khanda has this nature of clinging. And I'm going to make it even more clear by considering the alternative definition of upadana, which means taking up or taking onto oneself. As a person consumes the food, and they take up the food and they put it inside the body, and then the food becomes part of the body. So the khandas have this quality of picking up and taking something on. And now there's another observation that I made a long time ago about the 5 khandas, and that is that they have a way of working together as a kind of a bundle. I used to compare the five khandhas to a giant locomotive rolling down the tracks at great speed. And it's just about unstoppable. So when the khandhas are operating and doing their thing, you have to just suffer with the operation of the khandhas because it's impossible to stop them. But at the time, I thought, well, if one could learn how to not have them all working together like a big machine, but have them be disassembled into the elements, then it wouldn't have this momentum, it wouldn't have this force, it wouldn't be so powerful. Even if you could take one gear out of the locomotive and remove one gear, then the locomotive wouldn't work properly and it would gradually come to a stop. More recently, I got the idea, okay, what are the five khandhas? Form, that's the body. Feeling, that's the three kinds of feeling, pleasant, unpleasant, neutral. Perceptions, that would be the way we recognize our experiences. And then the volitional formations, that's volition. So these are quite similar, but not exactly the same as the four nutriments. And then the last of the five khandhas is consciousness. And Bhikkhu Analayo explains consciousness as being like if you take the first four aggregates, the form, that's the physical, and then the next three are mental, aspects of mentality. And if you brought them together in a fist, and the consciousness is the thumb, and the consciousness knows all the other four. So consciousness knows the body, it knows the feeling, it knows the intention, it knows the perceptions, it knows the intentions, and it binds them together. And so that binding together is creating the something that supports the delusion of the self. As long as they remain bound together, then you've got this bundle which is stuck together, rolling down the road of karmic action and rolling towards rebirth. More recently, I thought of a different metaphor, which is also, I think, useful in this idea of taking up. When you have a chemical reaction, you may have two or more elements, and the elements are come together, and some factors are added that are supporting a chemical reaction. And when that reaction happens, 2, 3, 4 different elements could be combined together, like one element is taking up some of the electrons from the other element or something like that. And they're formed together into a complex structure, which is very strong and stable and kind of rigid. And so I'm thinking now of consciousness as being like the reagent or the activating factor in the operation of the khandhas that causes them to fizz up together into a chemical reaction and emerge in something which has got a kind of like a structure that's got a certain rigidity, a certain kind of like a continuity. And again, it's this compounded aggregate thing, which, as long as the supporting conditions are there, will continue to roll along as a single unit, rolling on towards rebirth. But when the conditions change, there can be a different reaction that causes this bundle to be able to break up. It's for this reason that consciousness in a certain way is always been closely associated with, in my mind or in my experience, with the self. Like when you are consciously aware of the objects in your life, at that moment you seem to have a self as the subjective side of that active awareness. So there's a subject who's aware of an object. Or even if the object is the body, there's a subject which is aware of the body. Or even if the object is perception, there's a subject in the mind which is aware of perception as an object. So those are some of my ideas about it. But coming back to, I want to give you a kind of a brief review of what was said in the suttas and the commentaries about consciousness and the nama rupa. And so then when you read things in the suttas or you read things in your textbook about Buddhism, you'll be able to sort of like place them and put them into context. So in some of the later works, Visuddhimagga, Netipakarana, Abhidhammata Sangaha, these are Abhidhamma works or later commentarial works. Nama Rupa is defined as representing the individual as a whole, and in that way it's quite similar to the five khandhas, which are also described as representing the individual as a whole. And in that case, they take the elements that they've analyzed of the of nama rupa. So in an alternative explanation, without having to make this equation about the five khandhas, there's this is in the Maha Nibbāna Sutta. That's number 15 in the Digha Nikaya. There, Venerable Ananda says that he easily understands dependent origination. And the Buddha says, no, Ananda, please don't say that. Dependent origination is deep and difficult to understand. And then he gives a very profound and somewhat like a technical description about dependent origination. And what it has to say about name and form. For there to be any verbal or conceptual discernment of a sensory impression, that's a phassa, a contact, there must be both the factors of nama and rupa. If either side is absent, there is not contact. So nama means name, rupa means form. Nama sometimes is said to mean mentality or mind And rupa is said to mean the body. So, if you had a body without a mind, you could not have any discernment. If you had a mind without a body, it would be impossible. Then in the sutta, it says that consciousness is the fuel that conditions rebirth into a new state of existence. Something is born, reborn. There's the six sense fields. The six sense fields are the condition for contact. In a nutshell, according to this system, consciousness is the presence of experience or discernment, cognizing, seeing, knowing. And then nama rupa is the content of the experience, that which is known. Consciousness is the knowing. And nama is the mental factors we have for making sense out of the rupa, which is known. I told you before that the five khandhas are form, feeling, perception, volitional formations, and consciousness. Okay? In the explanation about name and form, name is said to be, a form is form, okay? And then name is said to be feeling, perception, volition, contact, and attention. But consciousness is not said to be part of name, because in dependent origination you have consciousness first and then you have name and form. And the commentators were trying to make sense of that. So they put the consciousness apart. So the consciousness is a different thing. Feeling, perception, volition, contact, attention. These are different aspects of our mental activities. And then form is the four elements of materiality and the qualities that are derived from that. Continuing in this, I'm going to jump ahead. So this is, I'm going to say that this whole theory about how we have our experiences, it's the department of philosophy called, I think, epistemology, which is about knowing and the limits of knowing, like how do we know what we know. My idea is that the Buddha was not that much interested in that department of philosophy, that his main interest was how we suffer, the possibility of coming to the end of suffering, and the way to the end of suffering. And his a more convincing explanation about this treatment of consciousness being related to name and form is something completely different that's coming from a dialogue that the Buddha was having with the preceding Vedic traditions. And in this case, you could look at Nama Rupa in the Chandogya Upanishad, which was definitely known to the Buddha. In this case, Nama Rupa is emphasized in terms of a great deity, the Creator God, who's exercising their will to multiply the elements of earth, fire, and water into a multitude of names and forms. So this is like the creation myth. And then, so the naming is something that the Creator God does to call a new being into existence. So the God separated the light from the darkness. He said, "Let there be light." He separated the water from the sky. In the Egyptian mythology, there's a giant cow who is associated with the creation myth, who is holding up the sky. So the cow's legs are planted on the earth and his back is holding up the sky. So he's made this separation of the earth and the sky as part of the creation story. So there's a certain way that Nama is a way that the Buddha redefined this religious mythology and applied his wonderful scientific mind to describe the phenomena of the operation of the human mind in a way of retelling the story in terms of those phenomenon of psychology. So then in another aspect of the Vedic tradition, there's this act of creation, which is you're creating a form and giving it a name. It's like when a child is born, when the father recognizes the child as being his child, and he gives his name to the child, and he makes that child the descendant and the heir to that family. So he has created the child into being the heir to the heritage of that family. Likewise, in the Vedic teachings, this making of name and form is associated with the Atman, or the Atta, or the soul of the Creator. So, just like the Father lives in the Son that He's given the name to, so the Atman undertakes consciousness in His named and formed self. I'm going to take another way of slicing this. While I was on retreat last winter, I happened to read a couple of books. I read some about science thinks about what philosophers think about what consciousness is and what it does. And one idea is that consciousness is able to discern like the edges of an object, the shape of an object, the color of an object, but it's able to make the distinction. Here I come back to the coffee cup. Consciousness is able to see one object as being separated from the things that are surrounding it. And then it's able to bind together all of the different things that could be experienced within this object and bind them together as all being part of this object. Consciousness is able to create a continuity that can recognize that it's the same object, even if it's very close or if it's far away. Consciousness can see it's still the same cup. Or even if it were turned upside down, the consciousness could recognize that it's the same object. It's kind of and it's an interesting process. Otherwise, everything that we experience would just be a blob of different kinds of sensations. Consciousness is also able to create a continuity in time. So if I came across the same cup tomorrow, consciousness is able to recognize that it's the same cup. And consciousness can also be applied to one's own self as an individual, and can recognize that what is creating the boundaries of what we consider to be this individual or this personality, although it's not so actually so clearly defined as the boundary of the cup. So I might, in my experience of who I am as an individual, I might include some kind of experience about my status in the community or in society, which is obviously a compounded thing about a relationship between myself and the surroundings. There are many other ways in which actually the creation of the self is an interdependent thing that's resulting from social interactions. So like when the little baby, the mother is training the baby, the mother is like gazing at the baby and saying ba 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 ba, and saying, oh, and being so happy and smiling, and and the baby starts to know that they are somebody because of the reflection of the mother's gaze. Even a good parent will be helping a child to know what kind of person they are. They may be like giving reflections back to the child. Here's a random example. If the father says to the daughter, when you look so much like your mother. When you grow up, you're going to be a beautiful woman. So that kind of like a powerful statement is creating a self, an image, an idea, a concept that girl may have about who she is, what the self is, what the boundaries are. But actually the self has been concocted and fabricated, just like the material self is fabricated from all the food we ever ate. And then our social idea of the self is is concocted and fabricated from all of the social interactions that we've ever had. But nevertheless, consciousness creates separate individual entities and recognizes them and cognizes them. So, in this way, the process of nama rupa, you could say that the rupa, or the form, or the material reality that is underlying all of our experiences, is kind of, it's like a silent and without meaning until this naming activity happens, where there's the social interaction, and a person sees and names and recognizes that object as being what it is. So then, considering this mythology about the creation God, who's causing a creation by bringing together nama and rupa in order to then create the diversity of the variety of many creatures and beings all throughout the world, and considering this more modern idea of consciousness as being something that can discern, it's like a seeing, which is a separating, can see the separation of individual objects from the surroundings and the stability of those characteristics, the identity of that object. It doesn't have to be like an idealistic thing that's saying, there is the essence of the cup, which, comes from God or something like that, that there's this soul of a cup or something like that. It's just that we have the ability to recognize objects in this kind of stable way. The Buddha said, it was said, with consciousness as a condition, there's mentality and materiality. How is that so? How that is so, Ananda, should be understood in this way. If consciousness were not to descend into the mother's womb, would mentality, materiality take shape in the womb? Certainly not, Venerable Sir. If, after descending into the womb, consciousness were to depart, would mentality, materiality be generated into the present state of being? Certainly not, Venerable Sir. If the consciousness of a young boy or girl were to be cut off, would mentality, materiality grow up, develop, and reach maturity? Certainly not, Venerable Sir. Therefore, Ananda, it is this is the cause, source, origin, and condition for mentality, materiality, namely consciousness. So in more traditional ideas, then this consciousness is just the factor of being awake, having something which is the spark of life that makes it possible to know anything. And if one becomes unconscious, or if a consciousness is taken away, that's synonymous with the death or the ending of this life, or with inability to thrive, inability to grow, inability to develop. In another sense, our creation as an individual through the process of our social interactions with mother and father, and subsequently with the world, and even subsequently with our own intelligence leading the interactions, that there is this process of naming and recognizing. And with that process of naming and recognizing, we create these objects, which become the objects that populate our world. And now I get to go back to the top of this chapter and remember the metaphor. This is coming back to the terrible metaphors of the punishment of nutriments. The nutriment consciousness is compared with the punishment of a criminal who 3 times a day is pierced with 300 spears. I say that these 300 spears are all of the objects that we created by the consciousness that created this separation, that created us as being a separate object in the world, which is populated by a lot of other separate objects, including all the other individuals who are alive, as well as the material objects. And then having fabricated a world filled with objects, then all these objects become, if not spears, at least like a club that we get beaten up with the objects that we've created. These sharp shafts of conscious awareness, it says, is like a punitive result of our previous karma, but it's inflicted on us at all times of the day, leaving us open to the impact of the world of objects. I don't feel that actually this talk has been the most coherent, but people who can write and speak coherently by consciousness all have PhDs. I mean, I have a master's degree. I don't have a PhD, and I'm not a philosopher. But I think that there's something in the action of consciousness that creates separate objects that have a compact identity, where it seems like all the parts of that object are united in being parts of a single object. And that this is creates a delusion of pure objects, where actually all those things are really compounded. They're not pure. This cup is not just made up of the essence of cup. It's, something that was fabricated and made and manufactured by somebody who was trying to sell cups. And so this whole aspect of like having this essential reality of an object, including our own self, especially, but it can be that what we perceive as our own self is having this essence, but also we're harmed when we perceive external objects as having that fixed, immutable presence. So if the world is unsatisfactory, if the world has an essential, unchangeable quality, then we're really stuck, aren't we? Because the world is then always and forever going to be horrible because it doesn't change. If another person has a moment of not being mindful or something like that, and they might say something that was hurtful or something that was unwise or something like that, if they're an immutable essential essence which is just containing one pure substance, which is that personage, and that personage just has their quality, and that quality is going to be the same forever and ever, then I'll have to cast them out and I'll put them in hell because they made a mistake. And so, well, that person's a big mistake, so, there they go. But because we know that we have a different way of looking at it, so we deliberately undermine this creative process of consciousness in order to allow things to fall apart and allow things to become unstuck, to allow them to change, and to see that everything that happens to us and around us are all just moments in a flowing river of causes and conditions, and the appearances that arise and present themselves to us because of the way all of the conditions are configured in a particular moment of time. So, they may look like this, or they may look like this. Or they may disappear completely. So consciousness is very useful. We got to have it. We need it. So just like intentions and contacts and food, it's part of life. We need to have it. It's part of a healthy life to have this faculty that's able to discern things and to create that continuity so that we can work with the different objects and make those distinctions. But then in order for us to reach the goal, we have to allow the consciousness to become unstuck, to relax, to open up, and to allow everything to be constantly changing, to allow everything to be in a constant state of conditionality, or the mutual interaction, mutual conditioning. And if we can have the change of view to just see the actions of consciousness as being sort of creating a type of a conventional reality that we can use for the moment, but we're not married to it. We don't pursue that kind of concept as something that's going to bring us to liberation. We just know that it's an appearance. To me, that would be the way to recognize that consciousness is, in a certain way, the culmination of all of the horribleness of the four nutriments, or the culmination of all of the horribleness of the five khandhas, because it's that thing which is trying to fix reality into an rigid and unchangeable thing, which is then barreling forward, being stuck in its pattern, unable to change, unable to unlock with that momentum, which is rolling forward into rebirth. And the rebirth is the biggest catastrophe of all. So, with this effort on my part, I invite comments and questions. If out of this, or out of whatever else you have read or experienced or heard from other Dhamma teachers, if you might have an idea, what would be the point of this teaching that the Buddha gave about consciousness? How is it useful for us to examine and consider and to know that consciousness is creating name and form? How can we work with this to have a healthy and sane way to be with the reality that we are conscious beings and our minds are continuously creating names and forms? Okay. Ren, who's here in the room with us still, is going to give an answer.
Or I can get closer.
Oh, wait a minute. It's come undone. Can you get that untangled? Thank you. When the light is on, the microphone is on. There you go. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you for the wonderful talk, Aya. I'm not sure if I fully have the answer, but I'm trying to discern a few different pieces of what you said. Okay, it's very clear that consciousness cognizes nama rupa, and then I just see connection between the 5 aggregates, including consciousness, with nama rupa, because that's my question. It's like, isn't the first aggregate rupa? Mm-hmm. And then the mind, which is equivalent to nama, I think I remember what you said, right? Mm-hmm. So the mind is equivalent to nama, and the mind has 4 different kind of elements, which kind of similar to that, to the 5 aggregates, except the mind has attention, which I remember as, okay, that's not part of 5 aggregate, but there's some overlap there. Mm-hmm. So that's what, I'm not sure if that's a question, I'm just kind of recognizing the overlap. My question is, you mentioned a couple times tonight and prior as well, the 6th sense. What is the 6th sense? Is that the mind? And also my question is, because the mind seems to play a very big part in whatever I read and what I understand, except tonight I realized, oh, it's a subdivision of whatnot. It's under consciousness. But so does the mind play any part at all in rebirth, or is it consciousness that bind everything together, and that's a consciousness that brings everything forward as a big engine? And if I were to attempt to answer your question, consciousness is the most important thing, because that's how we untangle the karma. That's how we untangle rebirth.
First of all, in the 5 khandhas, form is equivalent to rupa in Namarupa. Feeling, perceptions, and volitions are equivalent to the nama in Namarupa. And then the aggregate of consciousness is separate. It's not part of Namarupa. And even, even when I was speaking about the 5 aggregates, consciousness is different than the other 4. You know, the first 4 are like the 4 fingers, and the consciousness is like the thumb that grabs and holds them and binds them together. And so in the way that, in terms of this independent origination, that consciousness conditions name and form, and name and form conditions consciousness. So there's a mutual conditioning between those elements. But in that case, it's explicitly that the consciousness is separated from name and form. As one of the 6 senses, the 5 senses are somewhat easier to understand, in the sense that it's we know that there's some kind of process happening with the organs of the body that are involved in sensing. We also know that there's an aspect of the nervous system in the brain which is involved in completing the process of any kind of sensation. So seeing is definitely involves the brain, and actually it also involves the mind in not just that, you know, light hits some cones and rods in the eyeball and causes some kind of electrical impulses going through the head, but then how does that arise to seeing? So this is could be explained by a very ambitious scientist as all being part of a brain process. But then the mind does get involved. Now, it is possible to have experiences that are not connected with any of the 5 senses. So if I said, don't think about Eskimos, and suddenly an image of a cartoon image or some kind of image of an Eskimo came up into your mind when you heard that word. So you didn't see an Eskimo in the room, but you some type of memory arose in the mind, and it created something that was similar to seeing. That was actually, if you scan the brain, you could see that imagining an Eskimo is sort of using some of the same parts of the brain that are involved in really seeing an Eskimo. If you think about, there's another experiment they do. They make them think about watching a tennis match, and as the ball is going like back and forth across the tennis court, they can watch the different parts of the brain lighting up in a way which is quite similar to what they would see if they monitored somebody who was actually watching a tennis game. So the mind sense that's called mano has two aspects. One is that the inputs that are coming from the five other senses get integrated into creating an object, actually, which could have, a single object like a cup of tea, or a person could have an appearance, a taste, a smell, and a sound. And the mind is what puts that all together and creates it into a perception, and also generates the feelings around it, whatever volitions we have towards it. All of that is happening at the level of mano. So that's one aspect of the mind sense, is as being like the meeting ground of the other five senses. But then another aspect of the mind sense is there could be ideas which are abstract, that are not necessarily able to be associated with the five senses. So you could have like the idea of a prime number would be an example of something that is not. I guess you could take all the numbers and you could try to divide them into equal parts. Like you can divide 6 can be divided into 3 groups of 2 or 2 groups of 3 or something like that. And then the number 7 is not able to be divided into any number of equal groups, and so 7 is a prime number. And it's possible that the mind, with its amazing fast processing, is actually recalling and recreating something that was a physical something that is related to something coming through the five senses. But that's the description of what the mind sense does. So it's just to acknowledge that there can be a memory or a plan, which is not something that's actually present at that moment to the five senses, but which has been generated by the mind, and which is very similar to something that could have been generated by the five senses. Is that enough? I didn't answer all your questions, but I answered some of them. I'll call on Richard.
Thank you, Aya. As I've mentioned before in a number of classes, I disagree with the translation of vijnana into consciousness. It really means cognition, and Bhikkhu Bodhi proves this by saying that there are many variations in that word, and the word consciousness in English has none of those variations. Basically, the word consciousness is just a standalone. You don't say, I'm consciousnessing or something like that. You just say, there's consciousness or there's no consciousness, whatever. But it doesn't have all these adverbs and adjectives and all these different uses. And so that's how he came to the conclusion that it's really cognition. However, he goes on translating in his later works, because this conclusion he came to many, many years ago in one of his early lecture series on the Majjhima Nikaya, as consciousness, because that's how Nanamoli was translating it. And he always says that he feels a certain need to respect his teacher and to continue on that tradition. Okay, so that's one thing. So therefore, what is consciousness in Pali? Well, if you look through the Pali dictionary, there is a word for consciousness, and that word is satta with one T, S-A-T-A. And from satta, we get sati, remembrance, because pure consciousness without any continuation or remembrance, right, wouldn't serve much function. In other words, if you were say you're watching a movie, right? And you're just seeing the images go by, but you have no memory of what happened before. You wouldn't know the roles, you wouldn't know the storyline, you wouldn't know anything that was going on, right? So and satta comes from satta, which is which means a being. Okay, so beings have satta, consciousness, and for that consciousness to work, they have sati, memory. And you can see how all these words in the Pāli are interrelated. So that's one point. Now, there's another point that you brought up, which is in a certain sutta. It says, and I think it's Sariputta who's speaking.
Mhm.
It says that consciousness conditions Namarupa and Namarupa conditions consciousness, and they're like two, what do you call them, grain stalks or something. I don't know if you know how people used to collect grain, they'd cut it with a sheath and then they'd take some of the grain and wrap it around and they'd make these round bundles. So it's like two bundles of grain leaning against each other. But I think this is a later interpretation that crept in and was an error, because if you look at the sutta, Sariputta is going backwards. Okay, so from old age and death, is caused because of birth, and birth is caused because of this, etc. And he comes all the way up to name and form, right? And then he goes into cognition, in my opinion, and at which point the interlocutor stops him in the middle of his discourse and asks a question, which came to be, well, is cognition connected to name? How are they connected to name and form? So he stops his description of going through the 12-fold chain at that point, because obviously the interlocutor is not following along. So to add the more steps is not going to help that person. And it's name and form, because that's the only dual concept that you have, other than the very beginning of old age, disease, and death, right? Everything else is a single term. So it's my opinion, and it's just my opinion, no one needs to accept it, that the actual question is, well, how does name and form relate to each other? Because that's the double concept there, and those are like two bundles of grain, leaning and supporting each other like that. But again, this is just my opinion. No one has to accept it. But because of the fact that dependent origination is sometimes described in various length lists, and some are shorter than, you might say, what we might think of as the main 12, although there are lists that have more than 12. Some modern scholars have speculated that originally Buddha only taught a certain type of shorter list, and then later on, this was fleshed out and made into what became a doctrinal 12-point list. But I don't agree with this at all. If you study each of the individual suttas where Buddha has a shorter list, depending on whether he's going forward or going backward, there's usually a reason why he'll start at a certain level or he'll end at a certain level, like in this case of Sariputta. The person he was speaking to was getting confused and lost and didn't quite understand the terms, and so he had to stop and just say, okay, let me just clarify that, and then we'll stop the lecture at this point. We won't go on further, giving the individual time to kind of go over it and understand it, meditate on it. And I think if you look at these different lists and these different suttas and the different lengths, you'll see, if you study it as a whole, that there's always some kind of reason for this. I know I'm getting a little off topic here, but I think it's an important point to understand, because there is a lot of modern scholarship that's kind of going off in different directions, and like you get to secular Buddhism and they start saying, well, there's no real rebirth. That was just an old thing from Brahminical culture, and it kind of got absorbed eventually into Buddhism and stuff like that. Whereas Buddha says, no, the uneducated worldling doesn't understand, rebirth. He doesn't understand these various, what you might say, fundamental topics. And because of that, he can't understand the Dharma. So you have to at least be able to understand certain fundamental topics, right? to understand the Buddha's teaching, on objective reality, Dhamma, on how the universe actually works, and how you interact with the universe and why certain things lead to, dukkha, usually translated as suffering. I prefer bad result, but it just depends on, I guess, what attracts your mind more. But without understanding these fundamental principles, nothing makes sense. Okay, it's like there's a discourse on where I'm not sure if it's the Buddha or Ananda or both give a similar discourse where they're discussing reasons why one should not become a monastic. What would be the point of becoming a monastic, of renouncing to a certain extent the world and everything. And some of them are like, well, if this is your only life, if you're a nihilist, right? What is the point? Because when this life is over, it's over. That's it, right? So a couple of those philosophies, they're kind of nihilistic philosophies, set aside, right? And then there's some other philosophies like fatalism. Well, if everything is just fate, right? If the Buddha up in the Tushita heaven, right, the what they think was the Bodhisattva, knew he was going to become a Buddha and came, well, that's a type of fatalism. Those are mythological stories. He's not coming down here. He doesn't know. And the gods are all taking birth with him to make sure they can hear his teaching. They don't know he's going to become a Buddha. That's fatalism, right? So there's
I
lots
think
of
we're getting a
false
little bit
concepts.
far away from the topic, Richard.
Right. But I'm just saying that that without a proper translation of some of these concepts and words, people are left to kind of speculate on these issues. And a lot of doctrinal things that came out later in commentaries and Buddha Ghosha's works and things like that, which were separated by many hundreds of years from the time of the Buddha, led to these various doctrinal interpretations, which are not actually found in the suttas themselves. But they were, as the meanings were getting lost, people were kind of struggling in the dark and trying to find, meaning in these things. But getting back to this thing about you didn't give the example, but where he talks about the bandit gets arrested and brought before the king, and the king for in the example of cognition or consciousness here in that Sutta 12. The flesh, the sun's flesh sutta,
Yes.
and he's getting hit with 100 spears, in the morning and in the afternoon and in the evening, right? But he's not dying. And so this is once you come into this world, you're basically like a thief, right? You're you don't really have any ownership of all these other things and life forms and stuff that you're eating for nutrition and everything, right? So you're basically like a robber, you know what I mean? You're taking these things, right? But ultimately, because of the nature of everything, right? The king is like he's like the Dhamma itself. You're going to get action and reaction, right? So you're going to have difficulty in the morning, difficulty in the afternoon, and not just but probably a number of difficulties, right? So that's 100 spears, and difficult, but you're not dying. Oh, he's not dead yet? Okay, let's start it over again, right? Another 100 spears, until finally at some point in time, you're going to pass away. So I think that's what the meaning of that is. And then it finally comes down to understanding name and form, that understanding of cognition, right? It says here, it is in such a way, bhikkhus, that I say the nutriment consciousness, cognition should be seen. When the nutriment consciousness, cognition is fully understood, name and form is fully understood, right? And when name and form is fully understood, I say there is nothing further that the noble disciple needs to do. Now, as I mentioned earlier, due to ignorance, imaginative ideas come up in your mind. And when that imaginative idea comes up in your mind, you're cognizant of that idea. And then you see what that idea is, and it's an idea, a name of a form. So because of that, when you understand that's where those name and forms are coming from, you can stop that ignorance in your mind. Oh, I'm doing this to myself. This is my own ignorance, because I'm not seeing Dhamma. I'm not seeing objective reality as it really is. So I can stop that process, and therefore I don't have to have those imaginary ideas of name and form that then I want to cling to and take birth and become, and then I have to go through all this suffering and difficulty and everything. Anyway, so that's basically all I wanted to say about that. Thank you for listening.
I appreciate your comment that the robber who's tortured with 300 spears is one who's basically like robbing from the world, in the sense that by taking these chunks out of reality and forming them into separate objects and then appropriating them as being me and mine, or something in relationship to self, that is a kind of that's the essential crime. Our original sin in Buddhism is when we are appropriating, taking onto ourself all of these objects, everything that we encounter. Even when we say, oh, that's not me, it's still a type of an appropriation. Not to mention when we say something is mine, or something is good for me, something is bad for me, something is a part of me, or something is separate from me. All of these things are this kind of appropriation, which could be compared to being a burglar, a robber, taking what doesn't belong to us and stealing it. I do also accept that cognition is a very good translation for vijnana, and it says in many places the function of vijnana is to cognize. So you could say the function of cognition is to cognize. Another alternative translation that I sort of like is discernment, because discernment has that sort of implication of making us the separation, making a separate object. So in any case, thank you for those ideas, and it's definitely worth investigation. Now I'm going to call on Damon.
Thank you. I'll just have a quick question because I saw Nirma and others may have questions.
Yes.
For our purposes, for the the more beginners amongst us, can we just work with the definition that the example I provided in the comments, wherein consciousness is an example of consciousness is the thoughts that we're having while we're eating, and we can have skillful use of consciousness by thinking, oh, this food is so that I can practice the Dhamma better, versus an unskillful use of consciousness would be, oh, this tastes great, please give me more.
I think the consciousness always has got some kind of there's something about me which is involved in consciousness. So this food is good for me is a kind of a statement that's saying it's like using that experience to create a self. But if you see sort of like a mutual conditioning between the food and this body, that's an example of an approach to consciousness which is getting away from this creation of a self.
Okay, but the working definition for our purposes with the 4 nutriments is consciousness can be described merely as, okay, we eat, and that's the sensory experience, and then consciousness is the thinking that we do about the eating. Is that too simplistic?
Yes, because forming a volition is also a kind of a thinking. So how is consciousness different than contact, which generates the feeling, you could say the feeling is a sort of a mental thing, and having the volition about it is also a mental thing. Even the idea of saying, let me take this food merely for the sake of keeping a healthy body, that's a type of a wholesome volition.
Okay, so then what would be, how is consciousness different than volition for our purposes during the retreat?
So consciousness is what, in my translation, discerns the objects. So here's the food, here's the tea. The tea is not part of me. And I just swallowed some tea. And now that bit of tea is in me. And that bit of tea has become part of me. The process of recognizing what's part of me or what's not part of me, and noticing, just cognizing that this is a separate object, that this is tea, and this is a microphone, and I can tell that tea is not the microphone's not the tea. That actually is what consciousness does. It's a very simple, very natural, very normal, and it's not inherently unhealthy to be able to tell the difference between a cup of tea and a microphone. But then when the consciousness gets involved in the song of me, this is a song, I heard it on the radio one time. It's a nice singer was saying me, 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 and it's just went on for 3 minutes like that. So that's like the aspect of consciousness that sees everything in relation to me, which then becomes a great danger.
Excellent. Thank you so much. That's so helpful.
Nirmala, do you still have something to add?
I was just a little confused, Aya, about, well, first thing, consciousness is responsible for rebirth, consciousness, name, form. And then I've also read, like the Dalai Lama in his talks says, everything is connected. Everybody is connected. The whole universe is connected. So there's separation and connectedness. So that's a little, maybe it's for another time. And then another question I had was rebirth. Everybody gets born. Rebirth can happen, and we cannot be a human every birth. Is it possible that do trees, everybody has a spirit, right? So is that also possible?
Well, whether the trees are and plants are sentient beings is something that I think the Buddha sort of avoided making that statement for some reason, but it might not be completely ruled out. In the olden times, they very frequently spoke of the gods that were living in the trees. And like the tree god is sort of like a way of expressing the spirit of the tree. And even a rock contains energy. So is there a spirit of the rock? We have to be careful when we talk about everybody having a spirit, because that can become like an idea of a soul, which the Buddha describes as a danger. That's sort of like the atta or the atman. But there is a certain way that this consciousness that we carry around with us, which enables us to discern all of these various things as being separate things, and all of these different things as having some connections and relationships to me, that and which, you know, it is almost sort of something like a spirit. But we don't really use that terminology so much of spirits. But I want to come back to what you brought up about the Dalai Lama with everything being interconnected. So by way of causation, indeed, the Buddha taught that all things are interconnected. And then this separation is something that is falsifying reality. So then when I said before, conventionally, it's convenient to be able to tell the difference between a microphone and a cup. But there is some kind of level at which the cup and the microphone are interrelated, that they're, you know, part of a whole. They're both objects in this lecture. So they have that relationship. And then not to mention a person, we might imagine that a person is a separate individual that has their own separate essence. Deep inside, they have their soul or their spirit or their essence, which is something that's very unique and individual, and there's only one of you or something like that. And but in fact, the phenomena of what we experience as being me is the product of so many interactions. And definitely in the case of a person or any kind of an animal or a sentient being, we could see that what they recognize as being themselves is not a separate thing. It's definitely interrelated, constantly interrelated and connected. And so then what discernment is doing, or what vijnana is doing when it's creating separate things, is a falsification of reality. And that makes it into a danger. Conventionally, it's convenient. But if we take that as being the ultimate reality, we're going down the wrong track.
Thank you, Aya.
Well, I would welcome everybody to carry on with being mindful, using sati, which is, this is another horrible translation, is translating sati as mindfulness, because what in the world does mindfulness mean? But if you use sati or memory, so sarati, so you're aware of your experience in such a clear way that you can remember. And you have the characteristic of sata, which Richard said, which is remembering or being conscious. And so be as clear as you can for the rest of this evening. Try to go to bed with awareness, intending to rest, and have the intention to wake up mindful. And then when you wake up in the morning, as soon as you can, be very clear and aware of what you're doing in the process of waking and getting up in the morning. Tomorrow, we're going to have another taste of the basic, just the basic morning program of the monastery. So at 5 o'clock, we'll be here for silent meditation. At 5:30, we'll have the morning puja chanting. And then at, I advertised 6:15, so not before 6:15, at 6:15, I will give a brief closing reflection and invite each of you, if you wish to give your own closing reflection about this retreat, what your intention is, what your wishes are for yourself and for your colleagues in the Dhamma. So that's the program for tomorrow. And this will bring tonight's talk to a close. Thank you, everybody, for your good participation and your patient listening.
Thank you, Aya. There was so much to take in, and my poor brain's going to take an awful long time to sort it out.